If you have a Bible and you like following along with the reading, please turn in it to Matthew chapter 11. Didn't coordinate this with Sunday school at all because in the C.S. Lewis study we're doing, I don't even look at it. I mean, I looked at it to formulate the questions, but that was 18 months ago. So for me, it's brand new when I see it, although I've got the questions in front of me. But I had no idea where we were going exactly today until I got there. But let's stop and think for just a moment here, concomitant with the Sunday school. We live, and I know everybody knows this, but I just want to paint this picture before I start. We live so insulated from the hard knocks of this world that I don't have any idea what it's like. For instance, if you live in sub-Saharan Africa, in anyone, you pick the country, Chad, Malawi, we don't go to bed at night concerned that a leopard's going to come in and take one of our children out of our house. They do. Or southern India, we don't walk to school. I walked to school, didn't you? Never occurred to me that a tiger might take my life on my way to school. They live with that in southern India. That's how 2/3 of the world lives. Now, I'm not saying that this is not a sermon on giving or anything else. It's one to say this. This is where we need the Bible so badly, because we are blind to so much. Not just the things like I'm describing, but extrapolate from our blindness to this world to what that means in terms of our spiritual blindness about ourselves and how we walk. Let's look at this text and see what it would teach us in this line of thinking. It's Matthew chapter 11. I'll begin reading as verse 15. Jesus says, "The one who has ears to hear, better listen. To what should I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplace who call out to one another. We played the flute, but you didn't dance. We played a dirge and wailed in mourning, but you didn't weep. John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he's a demoniac. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton, a drunk, the friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is vindicated by her deeds." Then Jesus began to criticize openly the cities in which he had done many of his miracles because they did not repent. "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! If the miracles done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes long ago. But I tell you, it'll be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you'll be thrown to hell. For if the miracles done among you had been done in Sodom, it would have continued to this day. But I tell you, it'll be more bearable for the region of Sodom on the day of judgment than it will be for you." Now, this is the most incredibly harsh. If you were a Jew in that crowd, you just had to be thinking, what's he going to say next? I mean, I don't even know how to quantify this in my own mind as to how I would have heard it were I a Jew in his day. They know what Sodom is. They know what happened in Gomorrah. They know the prophecies against Tyre. And they know what happened because it happened 300 years before this moment. Chorazin was a comfortable place to live if you were Jewish. Chorazin, Capernaum, and Bethsaida were known as, they were all comfortable places to live if you were Jewish, because they were known as the triumvirate of orthodoxy. That is, more Orthodox Jewish intelligentsia lived in those three cities than any place else in Judea except Jerusalem. There was a concentration of these people who were highly educated, Orthodox followers of Yahweh. And Jesus had done miracles in all three of those cities. And yet, they didn't repent. They didn't change. The Orthodox, the very people who were supposed to have recognized Jesus, Jesus said it, right? He said, if you really knew Moses, you'd know me. and yet they didn't recognize Jesus. The synagogues in these cities were all patterned after Herod's temple. They were ornate, beautiful places. I mean, they had copies of the Tanakh that were, the person who was orchestrating that service would hop up into the bema seat and read the Tanakh to the congregation. And there were good roads between these cities. You could hop on a road and go to Jerusalem if there was a festival. You could hop on a road and go from Chorazin to Capernaum. This was a wealthy, wealthy area because you've got Lake Gennesaret and all the fishing industry that took place. And then think of all the ancillary. It's kind of like I-75 goes through Valdosta and all these businesses pop up because there's wealth just by the fact of people moving through here. Chorazin, Capernaum, and Bethsaida were all of that ilk. So when Jesus points the finger at them, he's kind of like I don't want to make that comparison, a Tony Campolo of his day. He's looking at these places and saying, you people have everything you need. Then he talks about Tyre and Sidon, Phoenician seaport. In the day when Tyre and Sidon were at their peaks, Tyre and Sidon are really one place, but Tyre is actually the seaport itself. And these are Phoenician cities, and the Phoenicians were tremendous seafarers in their heyday. And in the day in which Tyre and Sidon were at their peaks, they were like Amazon. All the commercial traffic that had anything to do. Back then, if you wanted to take grain from Egypt and bring it to, say, Jerusalem, you didn't do it by land. You put them out in the water because they could go straight there like the crow flies much more quickly than you could move stuff like that across land. So they would take a boat and fill it, the whole bottom of it full underneath with grain, and away they went. That's how things were transported. And Tyre and Sidon were the hub. Tyre was the hub for that. Well, in Nebuchadnezzar's day, he laid siege and tried to conquer Tyre and Sidon. 15 years the siege went. Can you imagine living in those towns for 15 years? You got this gigantic army out there. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians were the superpower of their day. It'd be like being in Ukraine with Russia parked on your border right now. And he could not conquer the whole thing. Here's why. Tyre is on the mainland, on the shore, where the ports are. There's a little island a mile offshore with a fort built on it. A fortress is there. And any times the Tyrrhenians got in trouble, they just, at night, would paddle out to the fortress and then watch the army flail away with no results because they couldn't get out there. Nebuchadnezzar had no navy, all right? 250 years later, Alexander the Great shows up in the same spot. He wants to conquer Tyre too. At night, he has no navy. The Tyrrhenians sail off to their fortress and look back and just do like that to Alexander the Great and his armies. And guess what Alexander does? Ezekiel prophesied, Tyre, you will be torn down to the foundations, to the dust of the earth, and you will never be rebuilt. You know what Alexander did? He tore the whole place down, right down to the ground. He took all the rubble and built a road out to the island a mile away and conquered them. Wow. 250 years later, after Ezekiel's prophecy, and exactly what Ezekiel prophesied took place, Alexander the Great, with no knowledge of biblical prophecy whatsoever, fulfilled the prophecy. What's significant about this is we can hold our fist up to God all we want. And when God decides to do something, he's not really going to pay much attention to it in terms of the fist being held up. And yet, I want you to, if you can, put yourself in this mindset. You're a Tyrrhenian. You've sailed offshore. This has always worked for you. This is not the first time this has happened. It's always where you sail off, you go inside the fortress, they're fishing, they have plenty of food, they've got fresh water. You could stay out there for years if you have to. And you look and you see the army doing stuff. There's a dust cloud every day and you think, what are they doing? And then you start to see this road gradually, day by day by day by day, approaching your island out there, and you realize, oh, they're building a road out here. Our island's not quite as safe as we thought. I mean, just imagine If you're there and you've got children and elderly people and all these people watching this happen, when God says he's going to do something, he just does it. And you know, it says in the prophecy in Ezekiel that Tyre will never be rebuilt. It never was. It was rebuilt elsewhere. But the place where Tyre was is a bald rock that's covered mostly with water to this very day. Now, this just tells me that when Jesus says these things to these people that day, there's a lot that they don't know anything about, because this is Yahweh in the flesh talking to them. He knows all this. And so when he starts looking at these cities and says it'll be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you, he knows exactly what he means. What's going on here? What is Jesus trying to communicate, and what can we pull from it? There's no prophecy in here about Maynard or South Georgia or America or North America or Canada or anything else. What's it mean for us? Okay, Jesus says it'll be better for them in Tyre and Sidon than in Chorazin. And then he goes into this strange talk about John the Baptist and himself. It is strange. He says, and I've heard a lot of sermons on this passage. I think most of them are misguided, in my view. They've not quite captured what Jesus is actually saying here to us. He says, hey, they played happy music for John, and John wouldn't dance to it. What is John in this picture? John is a Jew, but he's an uber Jew. He's an uber Orthodox Jew. And so when they play the happy music, John is so strict in his Judaism, he knows that he is separate from all of the pagans that are playing the happy music. And he's not going to dance to it. Do you know, if you look through Jewish history, what got them in trouble throughout their history? They wouldn't dance to the pagan music. I remember when I was working in Annapolis, Maryland, this is a terrible thing to say, until I was 22 years old, I had never been further than South Florida in my life. And then I went to California, and that didn't work out, so I came back and I went to Maryland, which was still really far away. And I went to work on a bridge project there. I was not a Christian, didn't care anything about Jesus at all. It didn't matter to me one bit. And I was on a job where 220 other people who didn't care about Jesus were all working there. It was a bridge. We were building a bridge. There was the old bridge, the new bridge we were building, and there was this hill, and there was a chain link fence, and the parking lot was on the other side of the fence because the parking lot had always been there along with the fence. What it was a marina right next door to where we were working, and the marina had a bar. And they said, hey, you guys working on this bridge, you just park in our parking lot. Why did they say that? Because they knew they had 220 customers every 5 days a week out there, 6 days a week. And sure enough, at least 100 people would go to that bar every day. Well, I'm not a Christian, and I'm the new guy on the job, and they say, Rip, why don't you come join us? And you know, I've never been a bar person. I just don't like it. It's smoky. I don't smoke. I don't like the smell of smoke. People are drinking. I don't drink, not because I think there's something wrong with it, but nothing tastes good to me. It all tastes like the bull stepped over the glass instead. So I didn't drink. Finally, they pestered me to go. It wasn't because I was good. It wasn't because I'm moral that I didn't go. It was just, I don't want to go spend $15 or $18 of the money I just earned that day every day to go to this bar. But I went. And sure enough, it turned out just like I thought, and I never went back. Well, they kept pestering me. Then I became a Christian. They continued to pester me to go to this bar. What's the lesson? Vice needs company. Vice likes company. And the pagans that lived around the Jews could not stand the fact that the Jews wouldn't dance to the music. John the Baptist wouldn't dance to the music, so they hated him. All right, then Jesus comes and he does dance. He dances, he goes to weddings, he drinks wine, he sits in the house with tax collectors and Pharisees and all these bad people, talks to prostitutes, lets a woman who's committed adultery go. I mean, what's up with him? What are you seeing here? You're seeing the picture of God himself in these two men. You've got the God of justice and austerity and stricture, and you've got the God of, as the Bible says in the Sermon on the Mount. You know that word blessed in the Greek? Happy. It's the word happy. Happy. The happy God. The God who loves joy. The God who loves good food. The God who loves good music. The God who loves art. The God who loves us. So you've got the full picture of God here. But guess what? We don't want it. Human beings do not want the full picture of God. As C.S. Lewis said, we read this morning, we just want a piece of it. We want the piece we like. We don't want the whole thing. Vice needs affirmation. And then when somebody does participate, we're not happy with them either. We didn't like John. We don't like Jesus because really we don't like God. That's the bottom line. So you've got the two poles of God's character. And what you're seeing is the accurate representation of who God is compared to our misapprehensions of who God is. G.K. Chesterton said it so well. He said, the pagan is closer to God than most people sitting in the pews on Sunday. Because they're looking for him. Sometimes we're not. We are like Tyre. Now, I'm saying this to me. We. I didn't say you. We. We are like Tyre. Because we really, honestly, if in our depths of our hearts, we really, for most everything we do not need God at all. Correct. But that's what we think, right? We live that way, don't we? But you see, and there's only one way to come. I get into this with every atheist with whom I correspond, 50 or so a week. And it's always the same. Why won't God come to me? He will, but you've got to reach out to him first. He's not just going to come blasting in. You've got to come to him with at least a modicum of faith that he might answer you. Hebrews 11, very clear. No escape from it. And he's not going to custom fit his introduction to you for you just because you make the demand. I mean, why should he obligate himself to that? Why shouldn't it be that we have to show up for him in the way that he asks, which is we come believing on a bent knee? That makes sense to me. So the responsibility now is that we have the knowledge of all of this. We've been made aware of the reality of God, the love of God, the justice of God. We're aware of all of it. And then Paul says to the pagans in Athens that you might happily seek after him and grope for him. He's not far from any of us. He's not. That's why he spoke to him of the altar to the unknown God. I'm going to preach to you the one you don't know. So this is why the Jews would have been so shocked in Jesus' day. The Jewish culture in those three cities, and really predominantly in the whole of Judea, they felt themselves too big to fail, like GM. We've been at this for 1,500 years. Our father's Abraham. Yeah, but you've forgotten why you are where you are. You have forgotten what God gave you to do. You're the teachers of the law, as Jesus said to them, and you don't know these things? No, they didn't, because for them, it was just a gig. It had become a gig. God himself was not part of the gig any longer. It was just what they'd been doing, and it was all too big for them to fail. When Jesus prophesied over the temple, that must have just been, I bet people laughed at him. This big old thing, somebody's going to tear this down, there won't be another stone resting upon another. Titus made sure that happened. God used Titus, the Roman general, to make sure that not one stone rested upon another. They burned it to the ground. You see, the Jews in Jesus' day that were listening to him that day, they did not recognize Jesus because they had lost God in their purpose for being. That is so easy to do. Raise up a big ministry. It gets too big to fail. And then the people at the top, how many times has that car got to be put on the road before we realize it's real? It gets too big to fail. Too important. Doesn't matter that we're not praying. Doesn't matter that we're not asking God for guidance. Doesn't matter that maybe we're doing some things that are a little shaky. Doesn't mean anything. It's too big to fail. But when Jesus shows up for real, stuff changes. Stuff happens. So what's the solution? The human solution is just what they did. Let's call him a criminal and crucify him. That's the way we solve this problem. We don't like what he's saying. Why have you got to be so extreme, Jesus, in your faith? You know, John Bunyan. Paul Bunyan's the guy with the big bull named Blue. John Bunyan was put in prison for what? You know what they called it in England? The clergy had him put in prison for enthusiasm. That's what they called it. He was too extreme. Then he wrote Pilgrim's Progress while he was in prison. See, this is why gathering together is so important, because we live in a world that sooner or later, if we really live for Jesus, it's going to, at the very least, embarrass us, and at the worst, hurt us in some way. It's going to cost us something. And, you know, this is where all of the arguments that can be made to demonstrate the truth of the Bible, to demonstrate the existence of God, to demonstrate the proper historicity of the resurrection, all those things are great, but you come right up to the edges of it, and then unless God steps in, nothing's going to happen. The apologetic won't go any further than that. But you know, it's so interesting to me. I heard this from Christopher Hitchens, probably one of the most vociferous and hard-edged atheists who's ever lived in at least the modern time. He said this. You know what he said he hated more about Christianity than anything? No. This, seek and you will find. He said, I hate that. Of course, if you seek, you're going to find. Well, that's exactly what God has offered. Seek and you'll find. But this is God's way. And you know, it's so significant to me. I've known this to happen to several in my lifetime. The closer they got to God without believing, the more violent their resistance to him becomes. The tension grows greater and greater and greater, and either God wins or they win. And as C.S. Lewis so rightly says, God will come to us and say, not my will be done, yours, and walk off from the person. Why should we expect that God, this is Jesus' message to us and to them that day, why should we expect that God is going to reward defiance? Why? Why do we expect that? Why should we expect that God's going to respond on my terms and not his own? But you know, there's hope in all this, and that is that the greatest resistance tells me that God is near. He's near. So we say to ourselves, we sing it, Footsteps of Jesus, we sing stuff like that every Sunday, that really we want revival. We want God to so fill us up that we can't contain him. That's what I want. Okay, do we really want that? That's the question. And if we're going to really be there, that means our sight is going to have to be changed to the place wherein we look at everything in our life, no matter how insignificant, through the lenses of what does this mean for God's purposes? If we don't do that, I don't know that revival's coming. Now, you know, these revivals that are happening in Kentucky and California, man, thank the Lord for them. I'd love to see one in Maynard. Revival doesn't come to a church. Revival's not a scheduled day on a calendar either. It's where one person or 2 or 3 people are meeting and God shows up in such a way that they cannot contain it and it spreads. Do we want that in our own lives? I do. But are we willing then to cry out to God for it such that he'll do it? And are we willing then to surrender to it when it comes? Boy, I don't know. I mean, after today's Sunday school, I'm not so certain I am ready to surrender to it when it comes, personally. But you know what? There's no better place on earth for a human being to be, no more satisfying a way to live than to be in that surrendered place. We were built for that. And you know, calling out to God for that change and saying, no matter what it costs me, Lord, there is nothing to fear in that. Nothing. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes.